And now we're very excited to have our first session, all about land banks from the Center for Community Progress and also from New Jersey Institute of Technology. We have from Center for Community Progress, we have Tarik Abdelazim. Abdelazim, sorry. And from the New Jersey Institute of Technology, we have Cailyn Bruno. Okay, everybody, so if you would please take your seats, grab additional coffee and food, and we have a wonderful presentation for you all about land banks. And Tarik, if you would want to begin, you can come up to the podium, and we appreciate it. We'll get your slides set up.
So we're going for an hour, right? 11:50?
Yes. I would say, without much further ado, Tarik Abdelazim. Thank you.
Good morning, good morning. I won't make anyone else try to pronounce my last name, so you can just call me Tarik or Mr. A. It's always fascinating to hear stories about buildings like this, particularly this one, but it also invites some critical self-reflection in that I'm 3 years into a very minor rehab of my bathroom, and I'm always like, you're bad, you're bad. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us, Sylvia and Jason. I am here from the Center for Community Progress, here with our partner that we'll explain a little bit more about, Cailyn from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. How many folks have heard of Center for Community Progress? Oh boy, that was the equivalent of crickets. So we are the national leader, a nonprofit that helps communities deal with vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. We were founded in 2010. I serve as the Director of National Technical Assistance. We do this work all over the country, providing technical assistance, passing policy at the federal, state, local level, but also doing a lot of education, particularly with local governments and with land banks. We do this work focusing on delinquent property tax enforcement, housing and building code enforcement. A lot of folks also know us as kind of the trailblazers in helping expand the national land bank movement. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So much of our work has historically been with vacant lots and vacant structures, but there has been a lot more expansive work the last few years with land banks entering the Brownfield space. So here's a quick agenda. Just explain why we're here and our partnership. We'll do a quick Land Banks 101. Land banking in Maryland. There is still yet no land bank in Maryland. Not yet, but we're on the verge of a couple. Cailyn's going to take the Brownfields 101 session, and then we'll talk about some case studies where land banks are being engaged in brownfields and the benefits to having land banks involved in that. Hopefully we'll reserve some space for open discussion. So the EPA started to see some land banks in New York and Ohio apply for their grants, and this last year with their RFP, they added one grant award for a 4-year research initiative. And that was really the overall goal was to expand land banking's role in brownfield redevelopment. And so we secured the 4-year award as a partnership, and our planned activities, I mean, we have the whole network. We have the National Land Bank Network Summit, about 300 land banks, and so we could tap and leverage that. We'll do a lot of site visits, a lot of learning, and then put out a whole suite of educational resources. And then at the tail end of this initiative, we will be offering scholarships to communities maybe that want to start a land bank under their state law, maybe states that don't have a land bank law that want to pursue it, or existing land banks that want to expand their work. So, how many folks have heard of land banks? Okay, much better. Woo! All right, so as you may know, it's just exploded since 2008, following the Great Recession. Those are the states, 17, that have passed state-enabling legislation. The largest is collection of land banks: Ohio, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. But I mean, they're in Texas, we see some in Nebraska, so they're really all over, serving urban, rural, and suburban communities. Now, approximately 70%, and this was just based on this last year's land bank survey that our National Land Bank Network conducted, approximately 70% of all of the properties held collectively by land banks come through the tax foreclosure process. Right, so when we work with states to pass land bank legislation, we have to do a lot of kind of forensics as to their delinquent property tax enforcement systems, because there's 50 different systems all over the country and even more practiced locally, and really try to figure out how we can make those connections, because that is the primary role of a land bank, to serve at the back end of that delinquent property tax enforcement process, serve as a net to catch it, prevent them from going into speculation, and then get those properties back out predictably consistent with community priorities. The last line was leading to the next slide, so since we're a bit on a time crunch, just jump in here. Now, there is no land bank law that's the same at the state level. There is no land bank that is the same across the country, and the land banks are only as powerful as the state law allows. Some of them, quite frankly, a few of them, really aren't worth the paper they're written on. That's not Maryland. But there are also some that are incredibly powerful, although a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling, which we'll get into later as it pertains to Maryland, certainly is going to undercut some of the land bank's impacts across the country. So they have some special powers. That's why we have to work at the state, pass the legislation, and then local governments or county governments will create them. So they can acquire tax properties cost effectively. In some states, land banks can actually jump ahead of all investors or bidders at a tax auction, which is we have seen so many places where that auction process does not deliver positive outcomes, particularly in weaker neighborhood markets. And so the land bank pulls that in and serves as a public steward to get that back to positive outcomes. They also have the ability to not all of them, to extinguish liens and clear title, right? Some of these properties are just locked and saddled with thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of tax liens, water liens, code liens, and they just have no market value. They're underwater. So a land bank can kind of zap those liens, clear title, and now free this property back to productive use. Hold property tax exempt. The disposition decisions, that's one of the key powers that land banks have. A lot of local governments, they're very restrictive disposition procedures, rightfully so. Sometimes when they issue RFP, they have to go with the highest bidder. A land bank is about the best outcome. If a land bank establishes affordable home ownership, first-time home ownership is a priority in its disposition policies, it can sell a property for $1 if that's what's going to be the outcome of that property. But because they have that power, they need to be accountable to the public. In all the legislation we pass, make sure they're transparent, make sure there's annual reports, try to drive some community advisory boards so that those who are most impacted by vacancy are actually have a seat at the table. Some funding mechanisms, but they're not great. As you can imagine, land banks are not a self-financing entity, right? These are properties that the market has passed over again and again. This is not a business enterprise. Again, this is a public steward that is going to require subsidy and investment to get these properties back out to community use. Any questions? I'm flying through here. Usually this is like an hour presentation. So any questions? Okay. So a couple things that we talk about land banks, they can't do this work alone. If you just think about a vacant lot, all the potential reuses, urban agriculture, pocket parks, green space, towards healthy environments, side lot sales, green stormwater infrastructure pursuant to a community's resiliency plan, right? There's a lot of different outcomes. And so the land bank works best when it's surrounded by all of those partners that are key to that redevelopment. One example we often tout, and there's incredible work all over the country, but Cuyahoga County in Ohio, we kind of call them the professional. They had just been a trailblazer in this work. They have perhaps the most innovative portfolio of housing programs. They had thousands and thousands of properties in their inventory and thousands of tax delinquent vacant homes that they could acquire. And so they decided, well, where are folks that need homes? And so they went to some of their human service agencies. The first one was the agency working with refugees and migrants. And so, you know, it's very difficult to house refugees. They have no credit history, et cetera. So they said, let's work with them. They found a house on a transit line out of their portfolio. They both cost shared the rehabs. Then they sold it to $1 to ISC, and now they house one of their clients, Housing First. Now they can provide the kind of support that they need. They said this worked so well, let's just go through all of the different human service agencies that are working with populations in need. And just an incredible network of programs that have been very positive for the community members. Do they work? Absolutely. And because there's been so much activity over the last 10, 13 years regarding land banks, there's a lot more research now about the interventions. So far more positive outcomes. Land banks, when they take properties as opposed to selling them to investors, they are far less likely to go into the foreclosure process, right? The demolition impacts have actually increased home values within a block, have decreased foreclosure rates on the same blocks. There's been economic and, health and wellness positive impacts that have been documented in research. So it's truly been an important community development tool that used to sit at the fringe of community development, but that in many communities now serves at the center of kind of transformational development. So, land banking in Maryland. Let me ask a quick question. Is anyone here either for local government or in a community where their local government might be talking about a land bank? Okay, a few. Apparently you all had to sit on the right side of the room. We can connect later if you want, if you have any questions. Again, since every legislation is different, just to run through a couple of the key provisions of your state's land banking legislation. Any government can create it, a municipality, a county, and also interregional through an intergovernmental agreement, so multiple municipalities and even multiple counties. The best thing, though, is to tie this always to the level of government at which tax enforcement and collection operates, right? Since it has to be really tied together, those systems, that's the best. Some administrative highlights. There are some laws that are very prescriptive about who can serve on a board, what the composition structure. This is basically full discretion given to local governments. A local government will pass an ordinance to create a land bank, and in that include their bylaws of incorporation, and that will spell out all of these different elements of how the entity will be administered and operated. You must comply with Open Meetings Act. Every year there's a report, both to the government that created the land bank and to the General Assembly. So a land bank can receive tax liens from foreclosing governmental units at no cost. But as you all know, Maryland, you have to offer that tax sale up at least, or that tax certificate up at least once for sale, which we're not a big fan of at Center for Community Progress, but hey, we'll chip away at it over the years. But if a tax lien is offered for sale and there is no bid, then that government can transfer it directly to the land bank. Now, there's some laws that we've helped pass in Maryland in the last few years that have actually created a whole new tax enforcement and foreclosure process called judicial in rem, which is way better. And local governments can opt in, all of them across the state. Baltimore City is the only one that's done it, and they're working through their first tranche. It basically, you remove the investors in the speculative auction, the government holds the debt, and then they foreclose on it, and then there's the opportunity to transfer to the land bank, with an important caveat that I'll mention in a second. Boy, I think it's dry in this room. Or it's that I've been in Austin last week, Newark yesterday, and now Baltimore. We're in Baltimore, right? Yes, okay. The land banks here in Maryland cannot extinguish liens, but the foreclosing governmental unit and the water district can release the liens upon request. But they can also take a quiet title action, and they can do bulk. So if they had 50 properties transferred from the foreclosing governmental unit to the land bank, they can go to the court and in one quiet title action, clean title on all 50. They can hold property tax exempt. So there's a lot of opportunities in Maryland, as we've seen from across the national field of practice. How are we doing with time? About 5 minutes? Okay. You can foster regionalism. And we know in Southern Maryland, there, a lot of smaller communities, municipalities, maybe that's an opportunity. Land banks, again, can purchase tax liens. What we've seen in some states is just to think about this as kind of a hub of equity, right, where it's homelessness prevention. If the state law mandates the sale of tax liens, maybe the land bank can come in and bid, compete for those tax liens, bring them in-house, and then actually work to keep the people in their home, right? Land banks can become more involved with brownfields. That's why we're here. You also have a receivership law in the state. Land banks are eligible to serve as receivers, so you kind of tie together some of these different VAD interventions, VAD, vacant, abandoned, deteriorated property. So there are some barriers, right? The first one is tax lien sales. Again, this is not a process that we support, particularly in weak housing markets. When you offer tax liens in weak housing markets to investors, they don't care a damn about the future vitality of that neighborhood, right? I get it, right? I'm not impugning them for seeking profit, but in regards to the system, it can wreak incredible havoc and inequitable outcomes. So this is not a process that we appreciate. The second thing, you can imagine if we're trying to build a land bank and the government is selling the tax liens, they basically just transferred the right of foreclosure to an investor when the whole goal was to foreclose and move it to a land bank, right? So you also lose your entire pipeline of vacant and abandoned properties, and they can continue to harm the neighborhoods, and those vulnerable homeowners can end up losing their home and their generational wealth. So 10 years ago, probably, maybe even in Baltimore City still, right, we've seen this, that there are so many vacant and abandoned properties, so many delinquent vacant and abandoned properties. And the tax lien sales would narrow that pipeline of properties for a land bank. Well, the hot markets right now have narrowed that pipeline even more. So communities like Buffalo that would auction off thousands of properties a year, now there's only like 100 properties being auctioned because the market's so hot and folks are just buying stuff up. There's increased activity of institutional investors in Newark. It's just unbelievable. And I'm sure some of your communities are experiencing the same. So with the sale of tax liens and the appreciating housing market, whatever might trickle into a land bank is going to be very small. And now there's a big problem that happened this May. Folks know about this case, Tyler versus Hennepin County? Okay, of course you don't. You're working on Brownfields. Like, this has nothing to do with it. Actually, it does a little bit. Basically, very quickly, it ruled that Hennepin County, Minnesota, was in violation of the constitutional takings clause when it foreclosed on Miss Tyler's home for $15,000 in taxes and then sold it for $40,000 and did not return the $25,000 to Miss Tyler. And this is a practice that happens probably in 15 states, has been happening for decades. And the Supreme Court just made a very unprecedented move into local tax foreclosure process and systems and said that that is now unconstitutional. So there are about 15 states right now that are needing to reform their laws because they have been taking surplus value in homes through that auction process. I mention that because we also believe that in states that sell tax liens, like Maryland, those foreclosing governmental units are going to be liable if they sell it to an investor, and then the investor forecloses, sells that property, and doesn't return the surplus proceeds to the owner. Okay, so Maryland has introduced a bill to fix that, to require a tax lien investor also. All you can get is the money that you put into it, right? You bought the tax lien and maybe some administrative cost, but there's no more stealing homes for $2,000 and then selling it for $100,000. right? Those days are over. We support that. But you could see that also it introduces a problem in the systems that we've been building for the last 10 years, right? Where we've connected land banks with delinquent property tax enforcement systems to move those vacant properties out of a cycle of decline and actually get them back into productive use. Right, so this is going to have impacts all across the country where we're really active land banks, and it is going to impact some of the features here in Maryland. Another barrier in Maryland, it's still largely unknown. I think, there was about a third of the people that raised their hands, but only a couple from local governments that are interested. And while this bill was passed in 2017, still 0 land banks in Maryland. And then lack of dedicated funding from the state. There's really only one state that has figured this out, that is Ohio, where they provide millions of recurring funding to their land banks every year, but there are not really effective funding mechanisms in other places, and so that is always a challenge with land banks. I think we hit the time, and then we're going to turn it over to Cailyn.
Great, thank you. Sylvia, if I can ask you to pull my slides up. My friend, are they in?
She integrated them. She's good. Oh.
Sorry, yeah. My friend Sylvia, I've been friends with her for over a decade. I know she's a planner, she's very organized, and I screwed that up a little for her this morning, but. All right, so my name is Cailyn Bruno. I am the Director of Environmental Services at the Center for Community Systems at NJIT. And as Tarik mentioned, we are partnering with them to explore and research the relationship of brownfields and land banks. And what I'm here to talk to you today about is just give a pretty brief overview of brownfields and the risks and the challenges that are involved with redeveloping these properties, and show you how a land bank can actually be a really great mechanism to address those sites and move your brownfields projects forward. Because as Tarik mentioned, the land banks, they're involved with vacant and abandoned properties, and brownfields can be a subset of those properties that they can take into their inventory. They just have a little environmental twist, as we all might know. Okay, so first I want to do a little survey with you. If you would humor me on your phone, you can pull up this QR code or go to www.mentee.com, enter that code, and I just have a quick question for you. It's, what do you think is the biggest challenge to overcome in brownfields redevelopment? Now, if you're a practitioner, this could be, in your experience, what the biggest challenge is. If you don't have experience, just what your perception is. And then I'll ask Sylvia to bring up our survey results. It's in your browser. Oh, yeah. There you go. You can press present on the top. Yeah. Is it working? Has anyone? Okay. Funding, money, unknown liabilities. Okay, cost, financing, environmental risk, environmental liability, which is also probably related to cost and funding. Emerging contamination, that's a good one. Oh, patience, perception, funding, liability. Okay, so I'm seeing a trend here. Sylvia, we can go back to my presentation. So At our research center at NJIT, we do work with a lot of communities in overcoming their brownfields challenges. And this is something I hear a lot. When I ask communities, what do you think is your biggest risk here? How come you're not foreclosing on this property and doing something with it? They say, well, we're very afraid, and our attorneys are very afraid that then we're going to be responsible for cleaning it up. And that's actually true. But there's a lot more to it than that as well. So you'd also be responsible for all the work leading up to getting to the point where you're ready to clean it up, right? So that's doing all the investigation, the environmental sampling. And then once you do clean it up, we're rarely cleaning up sites to like the pristine native natural state, right? So you might have some site management, some site monitoring that you'd be financially responsible for conducting. If there has been harm related to the surrounding community, you could be responsible for medical surveillance or finding a new clean source of water supply. I've worked on projects like this. You're also responsible for the infrastructure to hook that up. You should just be seeing dollar signs here. Any litigation costs. A big one that is becoming more prevalent now are these natural resource damages. These are like, you consider them more civil type cost recovery from the government based on damages to the ecology. So these are just like the regulatory responsibilities that you'd be liable for under CERCLA, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act in the 1980s. This is a very strict law. We needed it back then because we needed to hold polluters accountable for what they have done. But for local governments, like, sorry, I'm out. This is way too much, okay? You just don't have the resources, you don't have the capacity, and because of that reason, this is why we're all here today, because these sites have just been left to kind of linger in our communities. They can be unsecured, open for children to explore and play on. They can be big factories, or they could just be the corner gas station. And I think, Tarik touched on this a little, but they go beyond just being eyesores in communities. They do have physical and psychological impacts on the surrounding community. So it's very important that we address these. The good thing is, and I'm not going to say they're a blank canvas because obviously they are not, but they do hold the potential to become community needed uses. Things are going to bring jobs, things are going to bring access to open space, or just make people proud in the community that they live in. So that's why it's important that we take on this risk and the liability, we come up with a framework to address it, and put them back into productive reuse. Okay, so this is your general, there is no cookie cutter solution or one size fits all way to make this happen, but there is a general framework. It all starts with a solid foundation of planning. This is where you're going to create your brownfield inventory, prioritize your sites, really get your arms around the scope of the brownfield issues in your neighborhood or your community. Once you identify priority sites, you can go ahead and perform site assessment. These are your phase 1s, phase 2s, where you're doing a deep dive into the history of the site, taking samples, and determining, is this site actually contaminated or not? And if it is, then we could go into site remediation and redevelopment. There are things, so think of this process like growing a plant, right? So there are things that need to happen at the beginning and then all throughout this different stages here to foster and nurture your brownfield redevelopment process. Things like meaningful community engagement, building partnerships that are going to help you move that project forward, finding funding sources, and having a solid site reuse vision. Now, you might need to revisit some of these things, but think about what Tarik had talked about and the role and function of land banks. They are uniquely positioned to address all of those. And guess what? Those are liabilities and risks as well. If you don't have meaningful community engagement and you're trying to, if your project is something that the community doesn't want, they can really slow it down or stop the project altogether. So it's really important to recognize those risks as well. So now I'm going to talk a little more about the regulatory risks. And for those of us in the room, we've all probably heard about a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And okay, so once you have that document, your report, that's part of your liability protection, and you should be good to go. So is that true? How does that tie in with the role of a land bank and brownfields? And let's explore that just a little bit. So we're talking about liability, risk, regulations. I'm not an attorney, so don't take this as legal advice, but I'm not gonna get too far into it. But CERCLA, that really strict law that I had talked about before, they recognized that maybe the definitions were a little too strict, and back in 2018 revised the definition of an owner or operator to exempt a unit of state or local government when you acquire the property through involuntary means or something like tax foreclosure. So that is one layer of protection that the rule now gives to local governments. There is an exception, though, if you are responsible for the contamination. So really common examples of this at a local level are your DPW, Department of Public Works sites, or your good old town dump. So another way through the law that you can obtain liability protection is if you meet these 3 thresholds. So the first is perform all appropriate inquiry. That's your due diligence, doing that phase 1 environmental site assessment before you foreclose on a property or obtain it through those other unique ways that only a local government can. So that's pretty easy. Then demonstrate no affiliation with a responsible party for a local government. Again, this is pretty straightforward if you're not responsible in any way for the contamination. And the third, though, is where your continuing responsibilities to that site come into play. So the law says that you must comply with continuing obligations. It lists some of these. They're pretty straightforward. Some of them are just kind of administrative, but the biggie here to me is taking reasonable steps with respect to hazardous substance releases affecting a landowner's property. So this is kind of the caveat that even if you're not liable for the contamination, you're still responsible for cleaning it up. Now, the EPA does recognize that a unit of state or local government can be a redevelopment agency, a land bank, or a community development agency. Because again, the resources needed to even address the contamination, do the investigation, clean up, go beyond what most governments have available to them or have the capacity to do. So this is where the land bank can really be necessary. So the important thing too is that land banks are also eligible for funding through the EPA, so they can apply for and get grants through the EPA. And we've touched on this a little, but there's other federal programs as well that are involved in brownfields redevelopment, such as HUD or USDA, that have resources available. They're there, they want to give them out. And then you have your local, your Maryland resources as well. Yeah, so if we share this later, you have like some links and stuff that are available. I think now we're going to go into some examples of communities that have used land banks in order to address their brownfields. So Sylvia, if I can bother you to go back to Tarik's presentation. Yeah, you can go to, is Wayne County the first one? Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about this one. So this one is my favorite because they're relatively new. They are a county in upstate New York. They're mostly rural, farming community, but just like every community, they have brownfields. And they didn't have a way to address them because the local towns wanted to stay out of the chain of title for these properties. So they didn't foreclose on it, and they were, just able to sit there abandoned for decades. So they formed a land bank, and in partnership and coalition with the county itself, the Economic Development Corporation, and with the individual towns, they were able to win a grant through the EPA to create their inventory. So they got an assessment grant, they were able to do phase ones, do some sampling work, and then they were able to foreclose on the properties, confident that they weren't going in just totally blind, removing some of that risk. And now they have an inventory of sites that then they applied for EPA cleanup grants, and they also have a revolving loan fund. So they've kind of created this framework within the EPA grant system to address these sites, at least get them cleaned up in a place where you kind of have a weak market. It's not, you don't have private investors that are going to come in and take on this liability themselves. You're removing that risk, and they've had some success doing this. So, that's, I think, right now one of my favorite land banks. We also have Suffolk County. Do you want to talk about this one, or? So Suffolk County, this one is not new. They're very mature and very successful. And so this is another good example of what a land bank can be. So the Wayne County Land Bank, they take on any vacant or abandoned properties. So they do have some residential properties in their portfolio, but they also had the ability to take on some former commercial and industrial sites. Suffolk County, the way the market is there, they didn't need to really take on any of those residential sites. They were really just focused on the commercial and industrial. So their portfolio is almost entirely just brownfields. And to get their program kicked off, they did have an EPA grant, but they've been so successful that they haven't really had to seek funding from outside sources in a long time, just because of the profit that they've been able to make by flipping these properties, which they do share. They have agreements with the New York DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, so half of whatever they make on a property goes back into the DEC to address some of the environmental liens, and that's just the agreement they have there. What's next? Oh yeah, this is also...
Oh, yeah, I put this up here just for one reason. But if you want, yeah, that one right there.
Okay, did you want to talk about this?
Sure. We could stay up here together.
Yeah.
So I just thought this was interesting. This is the RFP they're doing is a massive former Air Force site, and it was just great. This request is intended to solicit proposals for developers that are consistent with community benefits identified in this document as an alternative to selling the property through the judicial system without community input. I just love that. That's exactly what a land bank is intended to do, right? To try to serve as a temporary public steward to get troubled assets, right? Land is our second most valuable asset, only to people in a community, and to get them reproduce or back out in positive reuse consistent with community priorities. And they've just done an incredible job. And that agreement that Cailyn had referenced with the DEC, it's the profit sharing, but it's also releasing, it can be releasing all liens, and it's with the Office of the Comptrollers, and it's ensuring that they have absolutely no liability. And it's affirming the protections that they have in the BUILD Act when they revised it in 2018. So that model has now, that agreement has now been passed by 7 other land banks in New York. There are, I think, 28. And it really has become an effective way to streamline that process at the back end. So you don't have to deal with it brownfield by brownfield by brownfield. It's just systematic. So last one is because I'm from New York, I felt guilty. I was putting just New York case studies up there, but there's really in many places across the country. So in Ohio, or excuse me, Michigan, Calhoun County, Land Bank, you know, it's just, this is typical, right? This is the work that you all do. So it's nothing groundbreaking, but just showing you that the land bank has basically become that entity that now is responsible for these brownfield redevelopment, and they've been very successful at it. In Ohio, just this last year, it's thanks to the ARPA funds, but the governor consistently says it wasn't ARPA funds, but obviously the coffers expanded considerably. They passed almost $900 million to deal with brownfield remediation and blight interventions. And I think there was almost 300 or 400 million just to address brownfields. Land banks are basically the governor's partners in implementing those funds all across the state. So it's just incredibly impressive as to what's happening in Ohio. So now we can open up for Q&A. You got to exercise. You got to come, unless you got a booming voice, just shout it.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to come up to the microphone. And, I can start a question for you. I had one quick question. Are there any statewide or regional land banks? Is that even possible?
Yeah, there are multiple states that have a statewide land bank. It kind of serves, it's also almost like historic in that it has served as the de facto holder of tax certificates or tax foreclosed properties that nobody wanted, right? So once we started to build, like in Michigan, you build the local and the county land banks, the state land bank has had less of a role, but it's served more as a partner. But there are still a couple states, Alabama, others that have it. I know, was it Connecticut that passed land banking, and I think it's just a state land bank, and the goal is specifically to focus on brownfields. And regional land banks, absolutely. Many all over the country.
Do you know if the Baltimore City Land Bank would be equipped to undertake brownfield redevelopment?
I don't know. Are you from Baltimore City? Because it's a heck of a battle going on right now.
Yes, yes, I am.
Yeah. We have, we've been working Baltimore since our founding in 2010, but very intentionally since 2016. And some of the work from Baltimore is what drove the legislative changes at the state level for the tax foreclosure and land banking law. We always support community, and there is a strong, strong community-driven effort in Baltimore City, and they want to see this land bank kind of play almost like a reparations role in so many of the disinvested residential neighborhoods. And we support what is being prioritized by those who are most impacted by vacancy. If it were to, and as I think we all know, there is plenty of work that needs to be done in regards to many of Baltimore's neighborhoods, not coincidentally where most black and brown folks live. And I think that to also throw on brownfield remediation might be very challenging, but I think it'd be better to get under its feet or get on its feet for a couple of years, and maybe brownfields in those same neighborhoods where they're doing focused work might be wise and could be an opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What about, don't land banks also have to worry about not necessarily liability, but when you're choosing which properties to take on, getting a sense of the scale of remediation, the cost of remediation, that sort of thing?
So even if you don't have to worry about cleaning it up right away, what are some of the considerations you take into account when you're trying to decide whether to take on a property as a land bank?
I would say that goes back to planning, really, because, I talked about the liability protection and the tool being the Phase 1 environmental site assessment that you can do, but there's also other planning tools that are available to land banks that they do and should use, such as doing market studies or equitable planning, things like that. So I would say definitely utilizing those tools, and you're doing the investigation, your Phase 1, your Phase 2, you only really need access to the property, and that's something, that work should definitely be done before you go ahead, foreclose, and take some acquisition of it. So you're not going in totally blind. It's kind of like doing a home inspection. Before you close the deal, you really have to know what you're getting into. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing
Oh,
to
sure.
that? And that is that, land banks should not be expected to carry out neighborhood planning, right? They should be a tool to help activate and implement effective and community-based plans. So I think Cailyn was absolutely spot on when she mentioned that, but I just want to make sure folks know, land banks should not play that role. You all set the stage for a land bank to come in and do great work.
I was wondering how Ohio got so lucky, and does Maryland have any, is anyone in Maryland advocating for similar funding stream?
So you were talking about the funding, you weren't talking about Cleveland Browns. Ooh, too soon? I was like, try it, see if there's an opening. I know, I'm actually a Ravens fan, so I felt you. They were very smart. It was a very, very smart, savvy lawyer from Cuyahoga County who had been dealing with vacant properties and had worked with our co-founder to pass the bill. And they were like, let's just try it. And what they did, it was called the delinquent tax assessment collection. And in Ohio, tax foreclosures happen at the county level. That's it. Right? So land banks can only be created at the county level. And they said that counties could take 5% of all of the money they collect with delinquent taxes, interest, and fees and shift it over to this dedicated fund for land banks. They have to opt into it. Incredibly, 70% of them have. And so for Cuyahoga County, it amounts to $7 million a year, which is incredible, right? And then I think that's why they can be trailblazers and innovate, because they're not chasing dollars, and they really have that time to do it.
Building on that question, in the absence of dedicated land bank funding at the state level, do you have examples from other states, New York or else, where other state funding has been successfully leveraged to support land banks?
Yeah, absolutely. Michigan just secured $30 million in the governor's budget, just as a one-time shot. Hopefully they can repeat it. New York did that and was able to repeat it 2 or 3 years. New York also, I think many folks know from the National Mortgage Settlement Funds, right? They went to every state. Some attorney generals, about 4 of them, directed a portion of those to land banks and vacancy, along with homeowner, foreclosure prevention. What was interesting, New York, the attorney general also has jurisdiction over Wall Street. So there were about 5 more settlements that no other state had access to, but New York did. And every settlement, the attorney general carved out funds for land bank funding. So New York has had a steady stream, but it's really the local governments who create them. They should commit some funds to the land bank, at least operational, so they can then go out and secure grant funds, because there are a lot of grant funds out there. There's a lot of philanthropic partners that want to support this work. But you have to realize that creating a land bank is actually going to save the local government money, because as Cailyn was saying, it's not just an eyesore. The fiscal costs, we've quantified the cost of vacant properties, and it's incredible how much local governments are spending in police, fire, code calls, and the loss of tax revenues as the tax assessments drop. So they're spending a lot. So now just shift some of those resources to a land bank if you're going to create it, and let's actually drive some investment and turn that around.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I'm interested in knowing whether some connection can be developed between land banks and affordable housing. You know, when new construction, new development is created in communities, often there's a legal requirement for affordable housing, which developers find it hard to meet. So could there be some concept of mitigation, like wetlands mitigation, where the land bank concept would be an offset for affordable housing?
Y'all don't want to talk about liability? We've fostered about, like 6 land bank community land trust partnerships, like formal partnerships with MOUs and everything across the country, and they've been very effective. But most land banks are really involved in affordable housing production. Yeah. And some of them, I mean, again, as I said, like they've moved to kind of the center. So they're supporting equitable development, inclusive neighborhoods, and more resilient communities, working with their water flood districts and stormwater and climate resiliency plans. So land, right? I mean, it really is one of our greatest assets.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cailyn and Tarik, for being here with us today and providing this education about brownfields and land banks. They both traveled here to be with us from out of state, so we really appreciate them making the trip. We're going to go into our next break. I think we have just about 10 minutes, 9 minutes, if everybody can be back by 11:50, and we'll continue. Thank you.